heavy, driving, orchestral score begins, laced with the sounds of a roaring turbine engine, the metallic clank of heavy tank treads, and the distant, sharp crack of anti-aircraft fire. The music builds a sense of overwhelming, modern power, then fades to a tense, rhythmic undercurrent. A deep, gravelly, and authoritative narrator's voice begins. Narrator. In the grand, sweeping narrative of war, history remembers the generals. It remembers the aces. It lionizes the heroes who charge the machine gun nest. But it almost always forgets the men in the shadows, the greasy, soot-covered, sleep-deprived men who make the war machine run, the mechanics, the technicians, the wrench-turners, the men who are handed a shattered, broken 30-ton piece of steel, riddled with holes and soaked in the ghosts of its previous crew, and are ordered to make it right by 0600. They are the unsung, the unseen, the silent foundation upon which all modern victory is built. But what happens when one of these men, one of these unknowns, sees a truth that the generals and the engineers in their high offices cannot? Tonight's story is about one of those men, an unknown mechanic, a man with no engineering degree, no budget, and no authority. Just a welding torch, a boneyard full of battlefield scrap, and a burning, desperate need to protect his brothers in arms. He saw a fatal flaw in their most powerful weapon. His superiors saw a standard operating procedure. He proposed a solution. They called it unauthorized, a violation, a waste of resources, and a logistical nightmare. So, he did it anyway, in secret, under the cover of darkness. He forged a monster, a machine that was ugly, unbalanced, and a violation of a dozen regulations. But to the enemy who had to face it, it was a terrifying, invincible ghost. This is the unknown mechanic who built a tank that terrified the enemy. Before we fire up that welding torch, if you believe these stories of grit, sacrifice, and battlefield innovation deserve to be told, I need you to secure our perimeter. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It's the best way to support the channel and ensure you never miss a report. Second, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this history matters. And finally, drop a comment down below. Let us know what country and city you're watching from. It is incredible to see our global community of history and hardware enthusiasts. All right, let's get to work. The cold was a living thing. It was December 1944, in the snow-choked pine-dark hell of the Ardennes forest, and the cold was a predator. It seeped through wool, through leather, through steel, its icy teeth sinking into the very marrow of the men of C Company, 10th Armored Division. But for Staff Sergeant Elias Scrap Thorne, the cold was secondary. The primary, all-consuming misery was the smell, a constant lingering miasma of burnt diesel, scorched paint, antifreeze, and something else, something coppery and sweet, the unforgettable stomach-turning stench of burned men. Eli was the motor pool chief, and his world was this smell. His job wasn't just to fix the M4 Sherman tanks that limped back to their makeshift field depot. His job was to cleanse them, to patch the holes, yes, but also to scrape and hose out the interiors, to erase the evidence of what an 80mm shell, or a Panzerfaust, or a Panther's long 75mm did to the soft human bodies trapped inside. He was a mechanic, a confessor, and an undertaker, all rolled into one. And he was failing. Not as a mechanic. He could fix anything. He could strip a radial engine in the dark, in a blizzard, and have it running by dawn. He could weld a patch over a fist-sized hole and have it hold. But he was failing to save them. The Sherman, the workhorse of the Allies, was a lie. And in the forests of the Bulge, the lie was being exposed in plumes of thick, black, greasy smoke. The men, in their grim, gallows humor, called it a Ronson, after the lighter's slogan, lights up the first time, every time. The Germans, with even less humor, called it the Tommy Cocker, the Tommy Cooker. Eli, standing in the frozen, blood-stained mud of his motor pool, surrounded by the hulks of tanks he had patched just days before, knew the name was accurate. He knew intimately what happened when a German high-velocity shell hit the thin, inadequate vertical side armor. He knew about the 42 rounds of 75mm ammunition stowed in the sponsons, right behind that paper-thin plate. turning the inside of the tank into an instantaneous, inescapable inferno. His crews knew it too. The ghosts, the survivors from the tanks that didn't brew up instantly, the ones who had to listen to their friends scream, they would come to his motor pool, their hands shaking, their eyes a million miles away. They wouldn't talk to the chaplain. They'd talk to Scrap. It just popped, Scrap. One young driver, a kid from Alabama named Pierce, had stammered. His face pale, his hands wrapped around a cup of Eli's battery acid strength coffee. Just pop. Not even loud. And then, the fire. God, Eli, the fire. It wasn't red. It was white. And the TC. Sergeant Jensen, he was just gone. He was screaming, and then he was just gone. Eli would just nod, hand the kid another cigarette, and go back to welding the patch on his tank, the sound of the welder's arc, a violent, angry hiss that did nothing to drown out the screams in his head. Then came the call, the one that finally broke him. Viper 3 is hit. Viper 3 is hit. Bad. Oh God, they're brewing up. On the road to Bastogne, just south of the crossroads. We're pulling back. We can't get to them. Oh God, Scrap, they're burning. Eli's blood turned to slush. Viper 3 was Sergeant Pete Grizz Rylance, his best friend, the man he had enlisted with back in 41, the man whose kids he was the godfather to. Grizz. Burning. He didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his .45, his coat, and roared at his own crew. Saddle up! M32, now! The M32 tank recovery vehicle, a Sherman chassis converted into a heavy-duty tow truck, was Eli's chariot. He drove, not his driver. He pushed the machine through the snow-choked lanes, his knuckles white on the levers, his teeth grinding so hard his jaw ached. He could see the smoke plume from a mile away, a thick black oily column against the pristine white winter sky. He found what was left of Viper 3 at the crossroads. It was still burning. A furious, roaring 70-ton pyre. It had been hit, and hit hard, by something that had punched straight through the front. But that wasn't the killing blow. The tank had tried to reverse, to escape, and in doing so, had exposed its side to another, unseen gun. The hole in the side sponson, right over the ammo rack, was a tiny, neat, almost polite circle, barely 3 inches wide, the mark of an .88, a fatal, perfect, devastating shot. The fire was so intense, the internal explosions had blown the turret clean off its ring. It sat, upside down, 20 feet away in a snowdrift, its 75mm gun buried in the frozen earth, a final, pathetic gesture of defeat. Eli Thorne sat in his M32, watching his best friend's funeral pyre, the sound of the distant, retreating battle a meaningless, mosquito buzz in his ears. The cold was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was a vast, hollow, white-hot rage. He waited for 2 hours under the cover of his own .50 cal until the fire died down, until the steel was just barely cool enough to touch, groaning and ticking in the freezing air. He hooked the cables himself. He dragged the blackened, stinking hulk back to his motor pool. And then he did the worst part of his job. He went inside. The interior was not a tank. It was a charnel house, a burnt steel cave, everything coated in a thick, oily black ash that had once been men, Grizz and his crew. 4 men, gone. Eli found what was left of his friend, identifiable only by the melted silver and turquoise Zippo lighter Eli had given him as a good luck charm, lying in the ashes below the TC's hatch. Eli Thorne, a man who hadn't cried since he was a child, a man who had patched up a dozen burnt-out tanks, finally, utterly, broke. He sat in the snow, behind the motor pool tent, the melted lighter in his hand, and he wept. Harsh, ragged, silent sobs that shook his entire body. But as the grief subsided, it was replaced by something else. Something harder. Resolution. This would not happen again. Not on his watch. He would not send another crew out to die in these paper-thin coffins. The book was wrong. The design was wrong. And if the Army wouldn't fix it, he would. He stormed into the company CP, a freezing lamp-lit tent, tracking mud and rage. Captain Wells, the 24-year-old CO who had taken over after the last one was killed, was there, poring over maps. He was a good man, Wells, but he was a bookman, a West Pointer. He believed in doctrine. "Sir," Eli's voice was a raw growl. He dropped the melted Zippo on the map table. Wells flinched. "That's what's left of Grizz, and Viper 3, and 88, side penetration, right in the sponson. They never stood a chance. It's the fourth one this week, sir. The side armor is paper." Wells looked at the Zippo, his face pale. "I know, Sergeant. It's tragic, but war is—" "Don't," Eli cut him off, his voice dangerously quiet. "Don't give me the war is hell speech, sir. This isn't war. This is a design flaw, a fatal one, and we are letting it happen." "What do you propose, Thorne?" Wells asked, his voice stiffening at the insubordination. "We're tankers. We rely on speed, on maneuver." "What maneuver, sir?" Eli shot back. "In these goddamn hedgerows? In these forest lanes? There is no maneuver. There's just head on, or get hit in the side. And our sides are worthless." He jabbed a finger at the map. "We need armor. Now. I don't care how. Let me weld the spare track links to the side sponsons. Let me take the belly plates off the wrecks and weld those on. No. Wells's voice was flat, cold, final. "Absolutely not." "Sir?" Eli couldn't believe it. "Sergeant," Wells said, standing up, the CO pulling rank, "I am not going to have my motor pool chief conducting unauthorized field expedient modifications on multi-million-dollar war machines. You will add weight, you will strain the engines, you will overload the transmissions, you will ruin the suspension. You will, in short, create more mechanical failures than you will solve. Your job, Sergeant, is to repair this equipment to factory specifications, not to reinvent it." Eli stared at him, his mind reeling. "Sir, with all due respect, what good is a factory-spec transmission when the crew is burnt to a crisp? What good is doctrine when it's getting us all killed?" "That's enough, Sergeant," Wells snapped. "I understand your grief. Grizz was a fine soldier. But letting your emotions compromise your military judgment is not an option. You are a mechanic. You are not an engineer. We are awaiting the new M4A3E2 jumbos from Ordnance. We are awaiting the wet stowage Shermans. Until then, we fight with what we have. Your job is to fix the tanks, not redesign them. Is that clear?" He stared Eli down, the captain's bars on his collar glinting in the lantern light. Eli felt the white-hot rage in his chest turn to ice. He saw it, the wall, the real enemy. It wasn't just the Germans. It was this, the book, the rules, the stupidity. "Yes, sir," Eli whispered, the words like ash in his mouth. Crystal clear. "Get your head straight, Thorne," Wells said, his voice softening slightly, mistaking Eli's cold fury for dejected compliance. "Grieve your friend, but then get back to work. Fix the tanks. That's your job. Dismissed." Eli turned, slowly. He walked out of the tent, back into the freezing, moonlit night. He walked past the rows of other Shermans, their crews sleeping fitfully inside, unaware of how thin the steel was that separated them from eternity. He walked back to his motor pool. He stood for a long time, just looking. He looked at the smoking, blackened, ruined hulk of Viper 3, Grizz's tomb. He looked at the melted Zippo in his hand. And then, he looked over at his boneyard. The corner of the depot where he kept the wrecks, the unfixables, the scrap. He saw the shattered, captured German Puma armored car. He saw the thick, angled steel plates of a destroyed SD KFZ 251 half-track. He saw steel, lots of it, ugly, enemy, available. Steel. He turned, his face a mask of cold, hard, unemotional calculation. He walked over to his welding shack. He woke up his best welder, a quiet, pale kid from Ohio named Miller. "Get your torch, kid," Eli said, his voice a low, flat, dangerous growl. "We're working late." "What? What are we working on, Sarge?" Miller asked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Eli looked at the Puma wreck, his mind already calculating cuts, angles, weights. "We're reinventing the tank, Miller," Eli said. "And we're not logging the hours. This one's off the book." The motor pool was a frozen, muddy field of despair, lit by the harsh, flickering glare of two portable floodlights that cast long, dancing shadows over the rows of sleeping tanks. Captain Wells's rejection echoed in Eli's head, a cold, hard finality. "You are a mechanic, not an engineer." The words were an insult, but to Eli they were a liberation. An engineer had to follow the rules of physics, of budgets, of bureaucracy. A mechanic just had to fix the problem. And the problem was that his friends were burning alive. He and Miller worked in the one place no officer ever ventured, the one place that was truly Eli's domain, the sarcophagus. It was a bombed-out, roofless stone and timber barn at the far edge of the depot, a place Eli had requisitioned for heavy parts storage, shielded from the wind and, more importantly, from prying eyes. Its gaping, shattered roof was covered by a patchwork of heavy, snow-dusted camouflage nets, making it just another dark lump in the landscape from the air, and invisible from the company's CP. It was here, in this cold, dark, secret workshop, that the heresy began. The first step was the riskiest, acquiring the patient. At 0200, when the camp was in its deepest, coldest slumber, Eli fired up the M32 wrecker, the muffled roar of its engine a sacrilege in the silence. He drove, not to the line, but to the back of the line, to Viper 4, the sister tank to Grizz's lost Viper 3, manned by a crew of green replacements who were, mercifully, heavy sleepers, huddled in a nearby tent. With Miller guiding him with a blacked-out flashlight, Eli hooked the tow cables. The screech of the M32's winch, the groan of the Sherman's tracks being dragged unwillingly through the frozen mud. Every sound was a betrayal, a potential gunshot that would bring the whole camp down on them. But no one came. They hauled the 35-ton Sherman into the dark, yawning maw of the sarcophagus, the camouflage nets brushing its aerial as it passed. The operating table was ready. Then came the harvest. Eli, a master of his M32, became a nocturnal predator in his own boneyard. He wasn't just grabbing scrap. He was butchering the dead to give life to the living. He dragged the carcasses of the German wrecks, the Puma armored car, the Settingkeff's 251 half-track, into the barn, their shattered metal screaming in protest. The boneyard was his parts store. The enemy was his supplier. He had seen, with a mechanic's eye, what the other tankers had just cursed. The Puma, a light scout car, had thick, exceptionally well-sloped frontal armor, designed to deflect shells. The 251 half-track had angled high-hardness side plates designed to defeat Allied 50-caliber rounds. This was not just steel. This was German-engineered, faceted, hardened steel. It was better than the flat, soft, mass-produced plate on their own Shermans. Miller, a small, pale kid from Ohio who was a wizard with a welding torch, looked at the pile of jagged, mismatched enemy steel, and then at the clean, green, vertical side of the Viper 4. His hands were visibly shaking, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice trembling, "this is... I can't. This is... What is this? Captain Wells. He'll have us shot. We're Frankensteining it. With Kraut parts." Eli Thorne just looked at him, his face a mask of soot and cold fury, his eyes reflecting the blue-white glare of the welding torch he'd just ignited. "Wells ain't here, kid," Eli growled. "Grizz is, and Petey, and Jensen. They're all here, and they're watching us." He handed Miller the plasma cutter. "Now you're gonna cut. You cut where I tell you. You weld where I tell you. You stop shaking. You're not a mechanic tonight. You're a surgeon, and we're gonna give this tank a new goddamn heart." Eli's design was a thing of brutal, instinctive, mechanical genius. He wasn't an engineer, so he wasn't bound by an engineer's rules. He didn't care about weight distribution or metallurgical homogeneity. He cared about stopping an 88mm shell. He had seen what a direct hit did, and he had seen what a glancing hit did. His entire concept was built not just on thickness, but on gaps. He had seen shells, especially the long, thin, high-velocity German rounds, tumble and lose their penetrating power after hitting the first, thin layer of a spaced armor Schürzenskirt on a Panzer IV. His fix would be a crude, massive, improvised version of that. He didn't have blueprints. He had chalk. He knelt in the dirt and drew on the side of the Sherman's hull where he wanted the armor. He wasn't just covering the sponsons. He was building a wall. First, he barked at Miller. The standoffs. He pointed at a pile of salvaged road wheels, the heavy, solid steel wheels from the boneyard's dead Shermans. Weld 'em on, 6 of 'em, right to the hull side. I want a gap, Miller. I want a 6-inch empty black hole of nothing between the hull and the new plate. That's where the shell dies. It hits the outer plate, it thinks it's won, and it comes apart in the gap. It'll be a goddamn ghost by the time it hits the real armor. Miller, his fear now replaced by the focused, adrenaline-fueled intensity of the task, went to work. The hiss-crackle of his torch was deafening in the stone barn, a beacon of their crime. He welded the heavy road wheels directly to the Sherman's hull, 6 massive steel discs. Creating the standoffs, Eli demanded. Then came the armor itself. "Give me the Puma's nose plate," Eli yelled. The Puma's frontal armor was a thick, beautifully angled single piece of hardened steel. It was heavy, but it was sloped. Eli had Miller cut it into 2 sections and weld it, at its existing perfect angle, onto the standoffs, covering the forward half of the hull sponson, right over the driver and co-driver. "Now the 251 plates," he roared. They were thinner, but wider, and already angled. They scavenged the side plates from the half-track, jagged and pockmarked from whatever had killed it, and stitched them, as Eli called it, to the remaining standoffs, covering the vulnerable ammunition racks. The welding was not pretty. It was not the clean, precise stack of dimes of a factory. It was thick, crude, ugly, overlapping beads of slag-heavy metal, what Eli called scab welding. He didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about strength. He had Miller weld and re-weld and then weld again, bracing the plates with I-beams cut from the half-track's chassis. The result was an abomination. It was a jagged, multi-layered, chaotic exoskeleton of mismatched, scorched enemy steel bolted and welded onto the clean, simple lines of the Sherman. It was hideous, and it was just the beginning. Eli looked at the turret. The M4's turret was cast, rounded, but still fatally thin on the sides. The turret too, kid, all of it. They spent hours meticulously, agonizingly, cutting smaller, curved sections from the Puma's turret and the 251's hull, heating them with the torch, hammering them against the Sherman's turret cheek, and then scab welding them on, creating a crude, layered, patchwork second skin. They worked in a frantic, desperate race against the dawn. Their paranoia, a palpable thing. Twice, Eli doused the lights, grabbing his .45, his heart leaping into his throat, at the sound of a distant engine. A truck convoy moving on the main road. A lost jeep. Each time they waited in the freezing, absolute darkness, their breath pluming, the tick-tick-tick of the cooling metal the only sound, until the danger passed. As the first sick gray light of 4 a.m. began to creep through the shattered roof of the barn, they were done. They stepped back, their bodies aching, their lungs burning, their hands raw. Miller, his face black with soot, just stared, his welding torch hanging, forgotten, in his limp hand. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice a reedy sound of pure, unadulterated horror. "What? What is it?" It's a monster." Eli Thorne looked at their creation. Viper 4 was gone. In its place stood something else. It was a tank, but it was a wrong tank. It was a Sherman that had been devoured and reborn as a brute. The added armor, at least 3 tons of it, had crushed the left side suspension. The tank was listing grotesquely, its left side tracks digging deep into the mud, its right side bogies lifted half off the ground. It was hideously, comically unbalanced. The armor itself was a nightmare, a cubist patchwork of dark gray German steel, scorched black from the torch, scabbed over with bubbling weld beads, all layered over the original olive drab green. It was angular where it should be curved, jagged where it should be smooth. It looked German. It looked like a Panzer, but a crude, desperate, field-made Panzer. It was, without a doubt, the ugliest, most unbalanced, most insane-looking war machine in the entire Allied expeditionary force. Captain Wells. He wouldn't just court-martial them, he would have them shot. It's a failure, Sarge, Miller stammered, his eyes wide. It won't even drive straight. The suspension, the transmission. It'll tear itself apart in a mile. Wells was right. Eli just stood there, staring at his monster. He thought of Grizz. He thought of the 3-inch hole. He thought of the white fire. He walked up to the tank, to the thickest, ugliest part of his creation, the layered puma plate over the ammunition sponson. He rapped his knuckles on it. It didn't ping like the Sherman's thin hull. It made a deep, solid thud, a sound of finality, a sound of density. Maybe, Eli whispered, a slow, terrible, proud smile spreading across his face. Maybe it will tear itself apart. Maybe it will only go 5 miles an hour. Maybe it won't even steer. He turned to Miller, his eyes gleaming in the half-light, a fanatic's fire in them. But Miller, let an 88 hit that. Let him try. It ain't gonna burn. It will not burn. He grabbed a heavy tar-stained camouflage net. Now, help me hide this thing. And not a word. Not one goddamn word. They threw the heavy net over the lopsided abomination, shrouding it in darkness, just as the first, distant bugle call of reveille sounded from the main camp. The monster was born, and now it waited. The revelation in the sarcophagus was a moment frozen in time. The gray, watery light of the 4 a.m. dawn crept through the shattered roof, illuminating the monster Eli and Miller had created. Viper 4 was a blasphemy of steel, a grotesque chimera of American engineering and German brutality. The lopsided 7-ton list to port was nauseating. The jagged, sharp-angled plates scavenged from the enemy were a patchwork of dark yellow, gray, and scorched black, scabbed onto the Sherman's familiar olive-drab hull with thick, ugly bubbled welds that looked more like scar tissue than a factory seam. The road wheels, welded on as standoffs, gave the tank a bizarre, insectile appearance, as if it were already shedding its skin. It was, as Miller had whispered, a monster. It was a tank built from pure rage and grief. Eli Thorne, covered in soot, his eyes burning from the welding torch and a complete lack of sleep, stood before it, not as a mechanic, but as its creator. He felt a terrible, cold, paternal pride. This thing was ugly. This thing was wrong. But it was thick. It was a fist of pure, layered steel, aimed at the heart of the German 88. He threw the heavy canvas tarpaulin over it, shrouding the abomination in darkness, his heart hammering a frantic, exhausted rhythm against his ribs. He and Miller slipped out of the barn just as the first, distant bugle call of reveille sounded, 2 criminals melting back into the pre-dawn shadows, their crime hidden, waiting. For 2 days, the monster slept. 2 days of agonizing, nerve-shredding tension. Eli and Miller went about their duties in a zombie-like state of sleep deprivation and paranoid terror. Every time Captain Wells's shadow fell across the motor pool, Eli braced for the inevitable confrontation. Viper 4 was officially listed in the logs as undergoing critical transmission overhaul, a lie so thin it was transparent. But Wells, consumed by the logistics of the full-scale German offensive that was now engulfing them all, was too busy to poke his head into a cold, dark barn at the edge of the depot. The Battle of the Bulge was raging. The 10th Armored was being thrown into the meat grinder piecemeal, their Shermans the only thing available to plug the gaps against the onslaught of Panther and Tiger tanks. And the reports coming back. They were a nightmare. Brewed up. Catastrophic kill. No survivors. The Ronson was living up to its name. The motor pool was a graveyard of crippled tanks, and Eli's repair crews were overwhelmed. The secret in the sarcophagus felt less like a crime and more like a desperate single option. The crisis came, as it always does, with the scream of a radio. It was just after 1400 on the second day. A frantic, high-pitched voice cut through the Tosi speaker so loud that everyone in the motor pool could hear it. Any Allied element, anyone on this net, this is Able Company, Sand Battalion, we are pinned. We are cut off. We are at the novel crossroads and we are being decimated. The blood drained from Eli's face. The novel crossroads. The same goddamn place Grizz had bought it. Viper 6, this is Able Lead. The voice continued, now choked with panic and the sound of deafening, close-range machine gun fire. We stumbled into a kill sack. They let us in and closed the door. Panzers in the woods, at least 3 of them. Heavy. Wait. Oh God. It's a tiger. I see it. A king tiger. It's hull down. At the tree line. North of the crossroads. It's just murdering us. We're pinned in the ditch. Our bazookas are just bouncing off. We need armor. We need armor. If anyone can hear this, for the love of God, help us. Captain Wells burst out of the CP tent, his face ashen. He looked at his ready board. 2 Shermans. Viper 1 and Viper 2. Both just refueled. Their crews trying to rest. It was a suicide mission. 2 standard M4s against a King Tiger in a prepared ambush. A King Tiger. The 70-ton boogeyman, a beast whose frontal armor was so thick it was rumored to be invulnerable to every gun the Allies had, let alone their puny 75mm. Sending those 2 tanks wasn't a rescue. It was a sacrifice. Wells looked at his tank commanders, his face a mask of pure agony. He couldn't give the order. He couldn't send 10 more men to burn. It was in that moment of paralyzing indecision that Eli Thorne stepped out of the shadows, his face a mask of soot and cold resolve. "Sir," Eli said, his voice quiet, cutting through the panic. "Viper 1 and 2 won't make it 50 yards. You know that. Their AP rounds will be like spitballs. That tiger will kill them before they're even in range." Wells snapped. "I am aware of the tactical disparity, Sergeant. What is your point?" "My point, sir," Eli said, "is that I have a 3rd tank." Wells stared at him. "What, Viper 4? You said its transmission was shot. You said it was non-mission capable." "I lied, sir," Eli said, his voice flat. "The transmission is fine, but she has a field expedient armor package. It's unconventional. It's heavy. It's slow. She won't go faster than 10 miles an hour tops. But I don't think an 88 can kill it." Wells's mind, a mind of logistics and regulations, was struggling to compute. "Field expedient armor? What are you talking about? You welded sandbags on it? I forbid." "No, sir," Eli said. "Not sandbags." He jerked his head towards the sarcophagus. "You should probably see it." Wells, his face a mask of confusion and dawning dread, followed Eli to the barn. Eli tore the camouflage net off the tank. The reaction was even more profound than he'd hoped. Wells didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He didn't even speak. He just stared. He looked at the jagged, lopsided, German steel-plated abomination, tilted at its drunken angle, looking like something that had crawled out of a junkyard nightmare. He looked at the 6 inches of black, space between the Puma plate and the hull. He looked at the crude, bubbled scab welds. He was a West Pointer, but he wasn't stupid. He was a tanker. He understood angles. He understood spaced armor. He understood what he was looking at. He was looking at a tank that was willing to sacrifice everything. Speed, agility, balance, reliability. For the one thing they all craved, survivability. He looked at Eli, his eyes wide, his face ashen. You did this? It's made of their own goddamn armor." "Yes, sir," Eli said. "She's ugly as hell." "She's a pig, but she won't burn." The radio screamed again. "God, where are you? He's coming. The tiger is moving. He's coming down the road. He's He's going to overrun us. Able Company is breaking. We're all dead. Game over, man. The panic was absolute. Wells was frozen, trapped between the certain death of his men and the insane, impossible promise of this thing. Sir, Eli said, his voice a hard slap. Make the call. Wells looked at the tank. He looked at the radio. He looked at Eli. He made his decision. It was the end of his career. He knew it. But it was the only decision a real leader could make. Who can even drive that goddamn thing? I will, Eli said. I'll command. Miller, he roared. You're gunning. Pierce. He pointed at the pale survivor from the other crews. You're driving. You've seen what fire is. You're not afraid of it. Rest of you, he bellowed to his mechanics. You're the loaders. We need ammo. All the ammo. Now. It wasn't a crew. It was a posse. A suicide squad. Captain, Eli said, already climbing up the jagged armor, you send Viper 1 and 2. But not with me. You send them around the east flank. Tell them to wait. Tell them to wait. For the distraction. What distraction, Thorne? Wells yelled up at him. Eli smiled, a terrible, cold, feral grin, as he dropped into the TC's hatch of his monster. Me, he roared over the sound of the engine catching. I'm the distraction. The tank roared to life, a protesting shriek of metal and overstressed gears. It lurched, lopsided, out of the sarcophagus, a wounded, angry, asymmetric beast, and crawled itself towards the gate. The other crews just stared, their faces a mask of terror and disbelief. They were watching a ghost tank, manned by a madman and his mechanics, driving a 10-mile-an-hour pile of junk armor, to go hunt a king tiger. The ride to Noville was 10 minutes of pure mechanical agony. The monster, as Miller had aptly named it, was a pig. It wasn't driving, it was wallowing. The entire 42-ton chassis, now grotesquely unbalanced by the 3 or 4 tons of scavenged German steel welded to its port side, listed violently like a ship in a heavy sea. The overloaded suspension on the left side was completely bottomed out, the bogie wheels grinding, the track scraping loudly against the hull with every lurch. The right side tracks barely seemed to touch the ground. Pierce, the young, terrified driver, wasn't steering. He was wrestling the tank, fighting the levers with all his strength, his knuckles white, his face a mask of sweat and terror, just to keep the lopsided beast pointed in a straight line. She's barely steering, Sarge, he yelled over the intercom, his voice a high-pitched, reedy whine. She wants to pull left, hard. The transmission whined, a high, piercing, screaming sound of tortured gears, protesting the immense, unbalanced load. 10 miles an hour, Max. We were a wounded, lurching, loud target. A cripple announcing his approach, crawling towards the most feared and powerful predator on the European battlefield. I stood in the commander's hatch, the freezing 20-degree air ripping at my face, but I was drenched in sweat. In my helmet, the screams from Able Company were getting clearer, more desperate, punctuated by the horrific, methodical boom, boom of a high-velocity cannon. It wasn't the sharp crack of our 75s. It was the deep, bass, authoritative thunder of an 88. He's advancing. The voice on the radio shrieked, a man sobbing in pure terror. The Tiger. It's moving. It's firing he into the ditch. Oh God, he's firing the Cokes. We're being cut to pieces. Able Company is. We're done. We're all dead. Game over, man. Game over. The transmission cut out, replaced by the deafening, soul-crushing hiss of static. My blood turned to ice. Game over. Not for us. Not for Grizz. Not again. Pierce! I roared, my voice a gravelly rasp I didn't recognize. Ram the goddamn levers if you have to. Get us to that crossroads. Miller, load AP, load armor piercing. You see anything that looks like a tank? You put a shell in it, you hear me? AP up! Miller yelled from below, his voice, surprisingly, almost steady. The kid had guts. I see the smoke, Sarge. Dead ahead. Crossroads. Maybe 400 yards. We burst through the last line of snow-covered pines, and the world ended. The crossroads at Noville wasn't a battlefield. It was a charnel house, a burning M8 armored car, 2 jeeps, flipped and flaming, their tires melting, and in the shallow ditches on either side of the road, the huddled, desperate, unmoving shapes of Able Company's infantry, their snow-white camouflage stained dark red. And there, in the middle of the road, not 300 yards away, sitting at a slight angle, its massive 70-ton bulk an obscenity of steel and arrogant power, was the Königstiger, the King Tiger, the monster of legends, its long 88mm gun, so long it seemed to defy physics, slowly, methodically, traversed, firing another high-explosive shell into the ditch. Boom. A geyser of snow, mud, and parts. It was murdering them. It hadn't even seen us. "Miller!" I roared, my voice cracking. "Target, the Tiger, now! Get his attention! Fire!" "On the way!" Miller screamed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask where. He just fired. The 75mm cannon on our Sherman cracked, a pathetic, small-caliber pop gun in the face of this apocalypse. The AP shell, I saw the tracer, flew true and sparked, a tiny, insulting, yellow-white flash as it bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's 100mm thick frontal turret armor. It was exactly what I knew would happen. A spitball. A nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was noise. It was movement. It was a challenge. The King Tiger stopped. Its methodical traverse towards the infantry ceased, and then, with a slow, hydraulic, majestic grace, the massive turret, the one with the gun that was killing everyone, began to turn. It was turning. Turning. To face us. "Oh God, Sarge," Pierce whispered, his voice a prayer. "He sees us. He sees us." "Good," I growled, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. "That's what we're here for." The long 88, a black hollow eye, settled perfectly on the center of our hull. This was it. The test. Grizz, Petey, Jensen, my fix, my ugly, lopsided, German steel-plated abomination. This was the moment. The Tiger's muzzle flashed, a brilliant, blinding, beautiful orange-white flower of death, a sound like the sky ripping in half, a shriek, and then, gong. The world detonated. It was not a clang. It was a catastrophe, a sound so profound, so loud, so violent that it wasn't a sound. It was just white. I was thrown violently against the inside of the hatch, my helmet cracking hard against the steel. The entire 42-ton tank was physically shoved sideways in the mud, a full 3 feet with a grotesque screech of metal. The inside of the turret was a hell of sparks, of pulverized paint, of spall hitting the walls like hail. But it wasn't hot. It wasn't the white fire. It wasn't the smell. "Status!" I screamed, my ears bleeding, my vision a swimming, white-spotted blur. "Status! Report! Now!" I'm alive," Miller yelled from below me, his voice a reedy, disbelieving shriek. "Holy God! I'm alive!" "Pierce, driver!" "Alive, Sarge!" Pierce sobbed. We're alive." I hauled myself up, my head ringing, my body a mass of bruises. The tank was filled with acrid, electrical-smelling smoke, but it wasn't the oily, greasy smoke of a Ronson. It wasn't the smell of burning men. I looked out. We were still here, lopsided, battered. My ears were ringing, but we were here. I looked at the side of our turret, at my fix, the ugly, jagged German plate I had welded on. It was destroyed. It was a molten, puckered, smoking crater, a hideous, glowing red pockmark the size of a dinner plate. The 88mm shell had hit it dead center. It had punched through the 40mm Puma plate. It had tumbled. It had disintegrated in the 6-inch gap. And it had splashed, harmlessly, against the actual Sherman hull, the hull that still had Grizz's ghost on it. It held. My God, it held. The King Tiger. It was just sitting there. Its crew, their crew, must have been in shock. They had just hit a Sherman, center mass, with the most powerful gun on the battlefield, and it hadn't blown up. It hadn't burned. It was still sitting there looking at them. This invincible, lopsided abomination. The Tiger's gun was already reloading, the breech block clanging. They were confused, but they were professionals. "Miller," I roared, my voice a sob of pure, insane triumph. "Hit him again. I don't care if it bounces. Make him look at us." Crack. Miller fired again, another useless AP shell sparking harmlessly off the Tiger's face. It was the distraction. It was all I needed. The Tiger commander was now fully obsessed with this. This invincible Sherman, this ghost tank that would not die. He was screaming at his gunner. He fired again. Gong. Another hit. This one on the hull side, smashing another one of my scab plates, rocking the tank, but again, not penetrating. "It's not working," I heard Miller laughing, a high-pitched maniacal giggle. "Sarge, it's not working on us." And then, from the right flank, the sound Wells and I had prayed for. The sharp crack of two more 75mm guns. Viper 1 and Viper 2. They had made it. They had come around the flank. The Tiger, its turret locked forward, obsessed with me, was a sitting duck. We watched as two AP tracers streaked across the field and disappeared into the Tiger's thin side armor, right under the turret ring. The massive tank just stopped. A thin wisp of smoke curled from its hatch. Then another. Then the hatch blew open and the crew bailed out, hands high, their faces masks of pure terror. They weren't afraid of the tanks that had killed them. They were staring at us, staring at the lopsided, smoking, invincible monster that had eaten two of their best shells and was still alive. We limped back to the motor pool just after sunset. The battle was over. Able Company was safe, their survivors already at our aid station, treating us, the mechanics, like kings. My tank, my Frankenstein, was barely moving, its transmission screaming, its suspension shattered, its left side a scorched, molten wreckage of twisted metal. But it was moving. We pulled in. Captain Wells was standing there, alone, in the dark. He just looked at the tank. He walked up to it, slowly. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the massive, gaping, black crater in the Puma plate, the place where the first 88 shell had hit. He looked at the untouched, pristine Sherman hull underneath. He looked at the second hit, the third. He looked at me as I climbed, deaf and aching, out of the hatch. He didn't say a word. He didn't mention a court-martial. He didn't mention the regulations. He just looked at me, his eyes saying everything. Then he cleared his throat. "Thorne," he said, his voice hoarse, "your transmission repair seems to have held up." He pointed at the other tanks in the line, the ones that were still pristine, still factory spec. "How many more can you make?" My folly had become doctrine, my ugly fix. It wasn't just a tank, it was a terror. And it was the only thing that was going to get us through this winter. Wells's question, "How many more can you make?" hung in the freezing diesel and ozone-choked air of the motor pool, a sentence so profound, so utterly subversive to the established order, that it seemed to suck all other sound from the world. The distant, chaotic crump of artillery, the shouts from the aid station, the panicked static from the radio, it all faded, replaced by this single, stunning, impossible inquiry. Eli Thorne, caked in soot, blood, and grime, his ears ringing from the 88mm impacts, just stared at his captain. This was the man who, not 24 hours earlier, had threatened him with a court-martial for compromising the suspension. This was the man who had preached the gospel of factory specifications as Eli's friends were being shoveled into graves. And now, this same man was standing in the dark, his face illuminated by the distant burning pyre of the king tiger his men had just killed, his eyes locked on the lopsided, smoking, hideous abomination that Eli had built, and he was asking for more. Eli looked at Miller, his welder, who was leaning against the shattered hull, his face a pale, trembling mask of shock and dazed triumph. He looked at Pierce, the driver, who had just performed a miracle of sheer, terrified nerve, maneuvering a 42-ton unbalanced pig into the jaws of death and holding it there. He looked at his other mechanics, now emerging from the shadows, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. He then looked back at Captain Wells. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "I told you so." The victory was too raw, the cost, Grizz and all the others, too high for triumph. He just gave a single, exhausted, greasy nod. "As many as you got scrapped for, Captain," Eli said, his voice a raw rasp. "You get me the steel, I'll get you the tanks." That night, the sarcophagus, Eli's secret illegal workshop, became the most important strategic location in the 10th Armored Division's sector. It was no longer a place of hiding. It was a factory. It was a forge. Captain Wells, in an act of breathtaking bureaucratic defiance, threw the full, desperate weight of his command behind Eli's unauthorized program. He declared the barn Level 5 restricted, live ordnance testing, posting his most loyal guards at the entrance with orders to shoot anyone, who tried to enter without his or Eli's personal clearance. He officially condemned the remaining German wrecks in the boneyard, striking them from the divisional inventory so they could be cannibalized without a paper trail. He diverted the division's entire precious hoarded supply of welding rods, oxygen, and acetylene to Eli's new special armor project. The two remaining factory-spec tanks in the company, Viper 1 and Viper 2, the ones that had gotten the kill shot on the Tiger, were immediately rolled into the sarcophagus, their crews nervously watching as Eli and his mechanics descended upon them with chalk, torches, and a wild, manic energy. The Thorn modification, as it was never officially called, was born. It was not a standardized upgrade. It was an art form, a brutal, desperate improvisation of steel and fire. Eli's crew, now expanded to include every welder and mechanic in the company, became a nocturnal priesthood, working in 18-hour shifts, fueled by adrenaline and a terrifying, newfound sense of purpose. They were no longer just repairing the Ronsons, they were redeeming them. Each tank became a unique monster, a reflection of the scrap they had available. Viper 1 received the thick, sloped side plates of a second, captured San KF's 251, creating a sleek, angular, German-looking profile that would later cause no small amount of confusion and friendly fire incidents, but which was brutally effective. Viper 2 got a different treatment. Eli, running low on wide plates, had his men cut the entire frontal glacis plate and turret mantlet from a burned-out Panzer IV and weld it directly onto the existing Sherman's front, creating a crude, thick, layered double glacis that looked like an iron snout. The lopsided, unbalanced nature of the Viper IV was a problem, however. It worked, but it was a transmission killer. Eli, learning from his first prototype, became more methodical. He insisted on balance. "We add 3 tons to the left, we add 3 tons to the right," he'd roar at Miller, over the shriek of the plasma cutter. "We're building tanks, not goddamn anchors." They began systematically stripping the belly armor plates from their own boneyard of dead Shermans, thick, heavy steel that was usually ignored, and welding them in layered, 6-inch spaced configurations along the entire hull sponson of every tank in the company. They created in 48 hours of non-stop, hellish metal-on-metal work, an entire company of Frankentanks. They were slow. They were ugly. They were overweight, their engines straining, their suspensions groaning in protest, their top speed a pathetic 15 miles per hour. And they were the most beautiful things the men of C Company had ever seen. The crews, when they were finally allowed to see their new mounts, were silent. They walked around them, touching the thick, crude scab welds, rapping their knuckles on the jagged, layered extra steel that now protected the ammunition racks. They saw the scorch marks from the torches, the mismatched paint, the brutal, purposeful ugliness. And for the first time since landing in Normandy, they felt something other than terror. They felt heavy. They felt safe. They nicknamed their new tanks the Junkyard Dogs, the Scrap Iron Saviors, or most commonly, Thorn's Bastards. The bastards went back into the fight, and the legend began. The German anti-tank gunners, the Packjägers, the arrogant aces who had feasted on Ronsons for months, were suddenly faced with an incomprehensible, terrifying new reality. A week later, in a desperate flanking action near Chanogne, Viper 1, with its new sleek German-looking side armor, crested a hill and came face-to-face with two dug-in PK-40 anti-tank guns. It was a perfectly laid trap, the exact scenario that had killed Grizz. The lead gun fired. Clang! The 75mm shell struck the improvised spaced armor, tumbled, and failed to penetrate. The gunner in Viper 1, a kid who had been on his knees praying just moments before, calmly traversed, fired one shell, and erased the gun crew. The second PK gun fired, a desperate, close-range shot. Gong! Another hit, another ricochet. The tank shook, but it did not burn. It crawled forward, a slow, lurching, invincible monster, its machine gun chattering, and the German gun crew, seeing their shots splash harmlessly off this jagged, wrong-looking Sherman, broke. They ran. They abandoned their gun and fled into the woods, screaming about a Geist Panzer, a ghost tank. The story spread like wildfire through the German lines, a virus of pure terror. The Americans had a new tank, a secret weapon. A tank that looked like a Sherman, but was built like a tiger. A tank that could not be killed. A tank that ate 80 Tyranidum shells for breakfast. The mythology of Thorne's Bastardsman became a psychological weapon far more effective than the steel itself. The sight of these lopsided, ugly, patchwork tanks. It sowed doubt. It caused hesitation. And in a tank duel, hesitation is death. Eli Thorne, the unknown mechanic, had not just built a tank. He had built a terror. When the siege of Bastogne was finally broken, and the 10th Armored was pulled back for refit, the Ordnance Corps inspectors finally saw Eli's creations. The reaction was apoplectic. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. Captain Wells was officially reprimanded for gross violation of technical orders and unauthorized modification of M4 chassis. Eli Thorne was officially written up, busted down to sergeant, and threatened with a court-martial that never came. Wells had quietly intervened, presenting the battle reports, the confirmed kills, and the stunningly low casualty rates of C Company compared to every other tank company in the sector. The bastards, every single one of them, were deemed unsafe, unbalanced, and logistically unsupportable. They were ordered to be scrapped, replaced by the new, proper, factory-built M4A3E2 jumbos that were finally arriving in theater. Eli watched, his face a mask of stone, as his monsters, the tanks that had held the line at Novel, the tanks that had terrified the panzer crews, were towed to the boneyard he had once raided, this time for good. His revolution was over. The book had won, but as he turned to walk away, a hand stopped him. It was Pierce, the young driver, his face no longer pale with fear, but hardened, confident. He, and the entire crew of the original, Viper 4, were standing there. They didn't say a word. Pierce just handed him something. A heavy, jagged, 8-inch piece of twisted metal, still scorched black. It was a fragment of the 80mm shell that had hit them, the one he had dug out of the charred, molten mess of the Puma plate. Eli Thorne, the unknown mechanic, the man who had defied a captain and redesigned a tank in a barn in the middle of the night, took the fragment. He never got a medal. His name was never in a history book. His fix was never adopted as doctrine. But he held the proof. He had faced the enemy, and he had fixed the problem. He had turned a squad of Ronsons into a pack of ghosts that terrified the enemy, and in doing so, he had brought his men home. The chunk of 80 mm shrapnel in Eli Thorne's hand was heavy, sharp, and still retained a faint, cold smell of burnt steel and propellant. It was a tangible piece of his defiance, a souvenir from an impossible victory. He stood there in the muddy, snow-swept motor pool, the sound of his bastards being towed away to the final scrapyard a dull, grinding ache in his chest. Captain Wells, having given his orders, had already disappeared back into the administrative warmth of the CP, leaving Eli alone with his men and his victory, which felt indistinguishable from a defeat. The official record, Eli knew, would be a sterile, bureaucratic lie. It would read, C Company, 10th Armored, encountered heavy resistance, neutralized enemy armor, and suffered minimal losses due to aggressive maneuver and superior crew gunnery. There would be no mention of Viper 4, no mention of scavenged German steel, no mention of 6-inch air gaps, and certainly no mention of a staff sergeant mechanic who had committed rank insubordination and fundamentally redesigned an entire company of tanks in a bombed-out barn. The Thorn modification would be buried, a footnote in a classified after-action report, dismissed as a dangerous non-standard anomaly. The jumbos would arrive, factory-approved uniform, and the war would move on, the system protecting itself from the uncomfortable truth that a grease-stained mechanic with a plasma cutter had, in 48 hours, built a more survivable tank for the specific hell of the Ardennes than their multi-million-dollar factories had. But Eli wasn't looking at the inspectors, or the retreating form of Captain Wells. He was looking at his crews, the men of C Company. They were no longer the pale, haunted, shell-shocked kids he had been pouring coffee for a week ago. They weren't the ghosts waiting to die. They were different. They were survivors. They were veterans, not just of combat, but of their combat in their tanks. They had a new, hard-won, almost reckless confidence. They had faced the Tiger, the King Tiger, the 80 mm Peke guns, in a machine they believed in, a machine that had worked, that had eaten the shells that should have killed them. They had a swagger. They called themselves the Scrappers, or the Junkyard Dogs, and they wore the title like a badge of honor. They knew what Eli had done. They knew he had risked a court-martial, risked everything, to give them a fighting chance. And in the brutal, unspoken currency of frontline combat, that knowledge forged a bond deeper than any regulation, stronger than any rank. Eli Thorn, the unknown mechanic, had become their unofficial leader, their talisman, their savior. He had not just given them armor, he had given them faith. And that, in the frozen hell of the Bulge, was a more potent weapon than any 75 mm gun. The true impact of Eli's ugly fix wasn't just measured in the survival of C Company's crews, it was measured in the minds of the enemy. Weeks later, after the Bulge had been contained and the slow, bloody push into Germany had begun, intelligence officers began to get a clearer picture. Interrogations of captured German tankers and anti-tank gunners from the 116th Panzer and the Führerbegleit Brigade, the very units that had opposed them, revealed a strange, persistent, and terrifying rumor. They spoke of Geistpanzer, ghost tanks. They described Frankenstein Shermans, lopsided, covered in crude, angled, mismatched steel plates, tanks that looked like they were already destroyed, yet which advanced implacably through hails of gunfire. They told of veteran PK-40 crews, men who had dozens of Sherman kills, firing perfect, direct hits at these wrong-looking tanks, only to watch their shells spark harmlessly off the bizarre, layered armor. They told of Tiger crews, confident in their 88s, hitting these bastard tanks 2-3 times, and seeing the American tank shudder, smoke, but not burn, not explode. They described a profound psychological terror. The weapon they knew was superior, the 88, was suddenly failing them against these specific, monstrous Shermans. This wasn't just combat. It was a violation of the laws of physics as they understood them. The myth of Thorn's bastards had done what 1,000 factory-spec Shermans never could. It had planted a seed of crippling doubt in the hearts of the German Jaegers. And that doubt, that split second of hesitation, that why isn't he burning moment, that was Eli's true victory. Eli Thorn finished the war as a master sergeant, his motor pool still the most efficient in the division, his official reprimand quietly lost by a grateful Captain Wells, who was now a major. Eli went home to Iowa, back to his family garage, a quiet, forgotten man who, for one desperate week, had held the fate of a company in his bare, greasy hands. His fix was never adopted. It was a one-off, A field-expedient solution born of unique desperation. A solution that was too heavy, too ugly, too unbalanced for the broad logistical realities of the wider war. The future, they said, was in the new M26 Pershing, in the wet stowage Shermans, in better tactics, not in bolting enemy scrap onto their tanks in a barn. Eli's ugly modification was destined to be a forgotten anecdote, a bizarre anomaly. But was it? Decades passed. The wars changed. The enemy changed. In the 2000s, in the urban concrete canyons of Iraq and Afghanistan, a new generation of American tankers found themselves in a terrifyingly similar position. Their M1 Abrams, a tank as dominant in its day as the Tiger had been in its, was suddenly vulnerable. Not to 88mm shells, but to a new, insidious threat. The EFP, the IED, the RPG-29. And the response? It wasn't to build a new tank. It was to adapt. It was to create the Tusk, the Tank Urban Survivability Kit. It was a package of, you guessed it, ugly, bolt-on, spaced and reactive armor plates, designed to defeat a specific new threat, sacrificing speed and aesthetics for pure, brutal survivability. The engineers who designed the Tusk, working in their high-tech labs, had likely never heard of a staff sergeant named Elias Thorne. They had never seen the sarcophagus, never smelled the inside of Grizz's Viper 3. But they were, in a very real sense, walking in his footsteps. They were applying the very same, desperate, field-expedient philosophy he had pioneered in the frozen mud of the Ardennes. The Thorne modification wasn't a dead end after all. It was just early. Eli Thorne, the unknown mechanic, never received a medal for what he did. His name isn't on any monument. He's not in the official histories, but his legacy is written in steel. It's written in the lives of the men of C Company who came home, who had children, who lived to see peace, all because their mechanic refused to accept the book solution. It's written in the terror of the German after-action reports, in the myth of the ghost tanks that wouldn't die. And it's written, in a spiritual sense, on every up-armored Humvee, every Tusk-equipped Abrams, every modern fighting vehicle that prioritizes the survival of its crew over the purity of its design. He was the unknown mechanic who, fueled by grief and rage, and armed with nothing but a welding torch and a boneyard of scrap, proved that the man who fixes the machine can sometimes be more important than the man who designs it. He built a terror. He forged a legend. And he brought his boys home?